The Battle of the Hydaspes, also known as the Battle of Jhelum or the First Battle of Jhelum, was fought in May 326 BCE between the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great and the Pauravas under King Porus. It took place on the banks of the Hydaspes River in what is now Punjab province, Pakistan, as part of Alexander's Indian campaign. In what was likely their most costly battle, the Macedonian army achieved a decisive victory over the Pauravas and captured King Porus. Subsequently, a large part of the Punjab region was annexed into the Macedonian Empire. However, Alexander reinstated Porus as ruler of the region, developing a newfound respect for Porus and his army's fierce resistance. Despite intense surveillance from Alexander's side, Porus was entrusted with regional authority, signaling a shift in Alexander's approach. Alexander's decision to cross the rain-swollen Hydaspes River and attack Porus's forces from the flank is often referred to as his masterpiece in battlefield strategy. The encounter between the Indians and Macedonians at Hydaspes remains a pivotal historical event, as it marked the beginning of Greek political and cultural influence in the Indian subcontinent, which would leave a lasting legacy for centuries. After the battle, Alexander continued advancing eastward toward the Ganges River, intending to extend his conquest deeper into modern-day India. However, in 326 BCE at the Hydaspes River, his war-weary troops who had campaigned with him for nearly 8 years refused to go further. Their weapons and armor were worn out, and there was growing concern among the troops that disaster might await them in India. Hydaspes thus marked the easternmost extent of Alexander's campaign. Upon his departure, he left King Porus in charge of the eastern frontier. Background: after defeating the last forces of the Achaemenid Empire under Bessus and Spitamenes in 328 BCE, Alexander began a new campaign in 327 BCE to extend his empire into India. He reinforced Bactria with 10,000 soldiers and invaded India through the Khyber Pass. Even though the opposing force had a much larger army, around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, Alexander crossed the river to confront them. During this campaign, Alexander suffered greater losses compared to his earlier victories. Initially, the main Greek forces entered through the Khyber Pass, but under Alexander's personal command, a smaller contingent took the northern route and captured the Aornos fortress. This fortress held legendary significance to the Greeks, as Heracles had supposedly failed to conquer it during his mythical Indian campaign. The local Hindu Kush tribes offered fierce resistance, but despite being outnumbered, estimated between 3:1 and 5:1, Alexander emerged victorious. At the start of the next spring, Alexander formed an alliance with Taxiles and joined forces against King Porus the Elder, the neighboring ruler of Hydaspes. Porus refused to submit to Alexander and prepared for war. Alexander had to defeat Porus to proceed eastward. Leaving such a formidable enemy at his flank would have been a serious risk, and to maintain the loyalty of previously defeated Indian princes, Alexander had to avoid showing any signs of weakness. Porus, on the other hand, was determined to defend his kingdom and selected a strategically advantageous battleground to block Alexander's advance. Though ultimately defeated, Porus became known as one of Alexander's most formidable opponents. According to historian Peter Green, Porus's performance in battle surpassed even that of Memnon of Rhodes and Spitamenes. Alexander camped on the north bank of the Jhelum River, while Porus positioned himself on the south bank to thwart any attempt at crossing. The river was deep and swift, making any direct crossing attempt extremely risky. Aware that a frontal assault was unlikely to succeed, Alexander sought alternative crossing points. While Porus kept shadowing him, Alexander moved his cavalry up and down the riverbanks nightly. Eventually, Alexander found a suitable crossing about 27 kilometers upstream from his main camp. There, the river split around a wooded, uninhabited island. He landed on the island while his troops crossed. His plan was a classic pincer movement, to attack Porus's main force from both sides, especially from the right flank. Alexander left Craterus behind with most of the army to conceal the crossing. Alexander himself led a strike force across the river, which included, according to the 2nd century Greek historian Arrian, around 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, though the number may have been even higher. Craterus was instructed to wait and attack only if Porus committed his entire force against Alexander, otherwise he was to hold his position. Additional forces under Meleager, Attalus, and Gorgias were also ordered to cross the river at various points during the operation. Crossing the river and facing the Indian army on the opposite bank was a remarkable feat by Alexander. The complex preparations for the crossing were accomplished through numerous deceptions and other forms of trickery. Porus had to keep moving constantly until he concluded that these were just feints and began to relax his vigilance. At each visit to the crossing site, Alexander would turn inward to maintain secrecy about his plan. It has also been reported that a lookalike of Alexander occupied a mock royal tent near the camp, projecting authority to mislead the enemy. Meanwhile, Alexander quietly led a portion of his army upstream and crossed the river in great secrecy, using inflated leather floats stuffed with straw and small boats cut in half, 30-odd galleys taken 3 at a time. Additionally, Craterus continued to pretend that he was about to cross the river. As a result, Porus, no longer expecting an attack in the darkness or a sudden move, grew complacent. Though Alexander mistakenly landed on an island, he quickly moved to the other bank. Realizing the trick, Porus sent a small force of cavalry and chariots led by his son, also named Porus, to try and prevent the crossing. Coincidentally, a storm broke out that night, masking the sounds of the crossing. Once across, Alexander advanced toward Porus's camp with all his cavalry and foot archers, leaving his phalanx behind. When young Porus's troops confronted them, Alexander's horse archers rained arrows upon them, while his heavy cavalry attacked without forming ranks. Young Porus faced an unexpected obstacle. The chariots became stuck in the muddy riverbank. His small force was completely defeated by Alexander's overwhelming cavalry, and he was killed in the clash. Upon hearing the news, the elder Porus realized Alexander had successfully crossed and advanced rapidly to confront him with the best part of his army. He left behind a small force to disrupt any crossing attempts by Craterus. Eventually, both armies faced each other and lined up for battle. The Indian army prepared with cavalry on both flanks, chariots in front, and infantry in the center, where war elephants were stationed every 50 feet to resist the Macedonian cavalry. These elephants were heavily armored, and on their backs were fortress-like howdahs carrying 3 archers and spearmen each. Porus's soldiers wore steel helmets, bright scarves, and baldricks, wielding axes, spears, and maces. Eschewing the Indian tradition of fighting from a chariot, Porus mounted the tallest war elephant. This particular beast was not equipped with a howdah, as the king wore chainmail armor and did not require the added protection. Alexander observed that Porus's center was the strongest and decided to first attack the flanks with his cavalry, holding back until the Indian cavalry was neutralized. The Macedonian heavy infantry outnumbered the Indian infantry 5-1, but their lack of armor and the opponent's long spears made them vulnerable in close combat. Even their powerful longbows were less effective due to the slippery terrain, though the muddy ground also disadvantaged the lightly armored Indians. Alexander began the battle by sending his mounted archers to harass the Indian right-wing cavalry. His armored companion cavalry was sent to attack the Indian left, with Alexander personally leading the charge, as was his habit. When the remaining Indian cavalry rushed to support the right flank, Coenus's squadrons immediately followed and attacked from behind. Attempting to counter both attacks, the Indian cavalry formed a double phalanx, but the complexity of the maneuver caused confusion in their ranks, making it easier for the Macedonian cavalry to rout them. Defeated, the Indian cavalry retreated to the safety of their elephants. Now, the war elephants advanced against the Macedonian cavalry but encountered the Macedonian phalanx. The mighty beasts inflicted severe casualties on the Macedonian infantry, goring men with steel-covered tusks, tossing some into the air, trampling others, and throwing the phalanx into disarray. Still, the Macedonian infantry resisted bravely. Light infantry targeted the mahouts and eyes of the elephants with javelins, while heavy infantry tried to hamstring the beasts using double-headed axes and kopis swords. Meanwhile, the Indian cavalry attempted another attack, but Alexander's reunited squadrons repelled them once again. The elephants eventually broke and fled back into their own lines. Many mahouts were killed by Macedonian missiles before they could use their poison-tipped rods to put down their frenzied elephants, and the rampaging beasts trampled many of their own infantry and cavalry, causing massive destruction. Finally, the Macedonian pesheteroi advanced with their shields locked, pressing into the disoriented enemy, while the Macedonian cavalry attacked from the rear in a classic hammer and anvil tactic, ultimately defeating the entire Indian army. Meanwhile, Craterus and his forces at the base camp successfully crossed the river and arrived at the perfect moment to pursue the fleeing Indians, completing the rout. It is said that throughout the entire battle, Alexander observed Porus' bravery with increasing admiration and understood that Porus would rather die in battle than be taken prisoner. Hoping to save the life of such a worthy leader and warrior, Alexander ordered Taxiles to persuade Porus to surrender. However, upon seeing his enemy, Porus was overcome with rage and, ignoring his proposal, hurled a spear at him. Porus's aggressive reaction forced Taxiles to flee on horseback. Similarly, several more envoys sent by the determined Alexander were rejected until finally, Porus's close friend Meroz convinced him to listen to Alexander's message. Thirsty and exhausted, Porus finally dismounted from his war elephant and asked for water. Once refreshed, he agreed to be taken to Alexander. Upon hearing that the Indian king was approaching, Alexander himself came out to meet him, and the famous surrender meeting took place. According to Arrian, Macedonian losses amounted to 80 infantrymen, 10 horse archers, 20 companions, and 200 other cavalry. However, military historian J.F.C. Fuller considered Diodorus's account of 1,000 Macedonian casualties more realistic. This was undoubtedly a high number for the victorious army, even greater than at Gaugamela, but considering the partial success of the Indian war elephants, it is not impossible. According to Arrian, Indian losses were 23,000. Diodorus reported 12,000 killed and over 9,000 captured. Since the last two figures are fairly close, it may be assumed that Arrian's total included prisoners. Among the Indian leadership, 2 of Porus's sons and his relative and ally Spitax were killed in battle, along with most of his commanders. Around 80 elephants were captured alive. After the battle, Alexander gained an additional 70 war elephants due to the delayed arrival of reinforcements summoned by King Porus, who surrendered immediately and offered the elephants as tribute. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Treat me as a king would treat another king." Impressed, Alexander truly did treat him like a king, allowing him to retain his territory. After the war, Alexander founded 2 cities, Bucephala and Nicaea, the latter named after the Greek word Nike in memory of his success at the battlefield, and the former across the river in honor of his faithful horse Bucephalus, who died during or after the battle. In 326 BCE, Alexander's army reached the borders of the Nanda Empire. Exhausted by constant campaigning and daunted by the possibility of facing another massive Indian army, his troops demanded to return westward. This happened at the Hydaspes River. Historians do not consider this a mutiny but rather growing military fatigue among the soldiers, which ultimately forced Alexander to concede. However, instead of retreating immediately, he ordered his army to march south along the Indus River, securing its banks as the boundary of his empire. The main reasons for Porus's defeat were Alexander's clever strategies and the superior discipline and technology of the Macedonians. The Indians used chariots that were inferior to Greek cavalry. They lacked a well-organized military infrastructure and a standing army. Indian infantry and cavalry were poorly armored, lacking metal armor, and their swords were no match for the Macedonian phalanx. Porus himself failed to take the initiative and mostly tried to respond to his opponent's actions. Greek historians agreed that Porus ultimately fought with great courage. During the later Maurya Empire, the strategist Kautilya took the Battle of the Hydaspes as a valuable lesson, emphasizing the need for military training before battle. The first Mauryan emperor, Chandragupta, maintained a standing army. In Mauryan military structure, chariots played a marginal role.